So I was invited to shed some light on innovation through a different lens, through the lens of improvisation. And my background is in anthropology and fashion, and a lot of my work and my approach is informed by the arts, specifically fashion, jazz, and dance. And this morning, I'd like to share more specifically about what we might learn from jazz. But I'm going to start with a visit to this building. Does it look familiar to anyone? It's in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it is the Dali Museum. Now, I'm from Philly, and my husband and I celebrate our wedding anniversary New Year's Day, and for obvious reasons, given the single-digit freezing temperatures in Philadelphia, we did a getaway to St. Petersburg last week. And I knew that there was a Dali Museum in the area, and to be honest with you, I wasn't quite driven to go to the Dali Museum specifically. I was more interested in going to see this exhibit. So Salvador Dali was an artist, a Spanish artist, and he was known for the Surrealism period in the 1920s and 1930s. And given my background in fashion, I was super excited, really, to see the work of Elsa Schiaparelli. Elsa Schiaparelli was a fashion designer around the same time, and she did a lot of collaboration with Dali. She was a contemporary of Coco Chanel, so a lot more people know about Chanel. So I mentioned that I wasn't really too driven to see the Dali Museum per se, because to be honest with you, even though I consider myself a bit of an enlightened person, I didn't really get Dali's work, and this is a photograph of Elsa and Salvador in the 1930s. The main reason why I never really got Dali's work was just that I thought it was a little creepy. I didn't really get it. I always felt like when I was looking at Salvador Dali's work, it made me feel like, you know, art is cool because it is what you make of it and what you want to get out of it. But I often felt like I'm not really certain what I'm supposed to be getting out of this. This is an example of one of his pieces from the 1930s called Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War. He did this in 1936, and P.S. the Spanish Civil War ended up being between 1936 and 1939. This is another piece that he did called Melting Watch. And he was really like all the surrealist painters and artists at that time. They were really trying to probe the imagination. They were really trying to distort, to invert and reverse, and tap into the dreamlike state to understand what might come next. Now, Elsa Schiaparelli, a colleague and contemporary of his, her work I totally got, totally love. So whether it was her timeless pieces like you see on the black and white on the screen, or that awesome dress that Taraji Henson is wearing in the center, which she wore to the Billboard Music Awards just this past December. Her work is timeless. It's constructed femininity, and I totally got it. So after going to this exhibit, I actually began to appreciate all that we can tap into surrealism, and it all is about context, right? So a lot of what Dali was looking at and what Schiaparelli were trying to do was to disrupt, right? We talk a lot about disruption when we talk about innovation. They were trying to probe beyond the present state, and this is an example of that. This is the lobster phone, and Salvador Dali was really infatuated with lobster because it's supposed to be a food that's an aphrodisiac, and he was also thought it was just a really cool inversion of an animal, right? Where the hard skeletal part is outside and the smushy bits are inside, kind of the reverse of us as human beings. And then Elsa Schiaparelli, she took inspiration from that, and she designed a very provocative dress. You can see what I mean by the placement of the lobster tail that she partnered with Dali on. So, and then even current days, the House of Schiaparelli. Salvador Dali did a lot of jewelry design. This was called the Eye of Time. And in 2014, the House of Schiaparelli did an interpretation of that brooch in this particular dress. So Surrealism is back, and Fast Company actually featured a piece on the Modern Museum of Art and all the interesting art that they have for sale in their gift shops right now that really is a nod back to Surrealism. And part of the point of this article was that it's actually really timely. We kind of need Surrealism in our time. We need an opportunity to invert and reverse and probe in new ways. So the question that I'm really passionate about and that I'm always trying to get to understand better is this question. How might we create, spark, and sustain wonder? We talk a lot about constraints and rigor and process, but in my view, none of that will be sustained if we don't have wonder. And I believe that improvisation is a way into that. So you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Most organizations today really get the basic foundational elements of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs says that on the fundamental level, what drives us, what motivates us, are our physical needs, right? It's food, clothing, and shelter. And then after that, we're motivated by safety. After that, as we climb up, we're motivated by social connection and belonging. And then there's esteem, and we can see how a lot of social media today is really speaking to the esteem piece and to the belonging piece. But the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, meaning and purpose, is actually what most companies are not doing so well today. It's what most organizations and processes are trying to figure out how to get better at. How do we deliver both meaning and purpose internally in our organizations as well as externally with our clients and to our customers? And from my perspective, one of the ways we can deliver more meaning and more purpose is to begin to figure out how we can work more improvisationally. Now, this will be an interactive session. I'm going to just give some context first for about 15 minutes. There should be some worksheets. If we don't have the worksheets, it's okay. We can continue to move forward. But I want you all to be thinking about how you could apply some of these ideas in your everyday work. So the Surrealism Movement, which Salvador Dali is really kind of the signature artist that people think of, the Surrealism Movement was typically connected to the visual arts and to literature. But in my view, it actually, jazz is something that is quite signature to the Surrealism Movement. And in fact, I believe it's the original Surrealist movement. And this is actually an image of the Oliver King Creole Jazz Band from the 1920s. It's no coincidence that jazz really started to emerge and evolve out of the margins of American society in the 20s and 30s at the same time as Surrealism was really trying to probe the current state. So the future of work, in my view, requires jazz. Now that's a big statement, I think. So a word about the future. If I'm going to say that, in my view, the future of work requires jazz, let me step back a little bit about that. This is Jim Dator. Jim Dator is known as a futurist, a foresight practitioner. And he has been known to have said that any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. So if that statement, that the future of work is about jazz, seemed a little ridiculous to you, maybe I'm on the right path. John Legend, talking about the future, said that the future started yesterday and we're already late. And then William Gibson, a science fiction writer, said the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So in order to think about how we could disrupt for the future, how we could really innovate, we do need some common ground and understanding about our present state, right? Because if we don't know where we currently are, how are we going to know how to disrupt it, how to get to some more interesting futures? So I'd like to share some observations that I've made about our present state environment. And these are just observations I've made based on a heuristic called STEEP, S-T-E-E-P. And STEEP is something that forecasters, trend researchers like to use to understand an environmental scan of where we are. The S stands for social drivers, the T stands for technological, the E's are for environmental and economic, and the P is all about political and policy drivers. So in our current states, when I look at and I scan our environment, some of what I see that we're dealing with are the following. Number one, we've got a big, what I would call, tech crush. We are infatuated with technology. People are always talking about today big data, big data, big data, without, in my view, an understanding that behind all of the data points are human beings, right? So technology, fundamentally, is a tool. But if we don't have an integration of the quantitative big data ways of understanding who our audiences are, who's out there, combined with the qualitative research that comes from interviewing and conversations and more of the on-the-ground research, that might be all for naught. The second observation I make about our current state is that we have a preoccupation with deep specialization, right? We see that in our higher education system, we see it in our healthcare system, we see it in some of the legacy industries that are trying to furiously figure out how they might disrupt themselves. So we've got this saturation in the marketplace of a lot of silos and a lot of depth. Most of us work in organizations that are full of silos, and some of us are trying to figure out how can we bridge those silos? How can we get to a much more collaborative work environment? The other observation I've made is that technologies like artificial intelligence, augmented reality, robotics are still a bit novel. Well, here's the news flash. They shouldn't be novel anymore. They're actually here. Amazon's Alexa is just one example of the Internet of Things, and it's, depending on how you look at it, encroachment or place in our private lives. And finally, the intuitive. I love intuition. I actually, in part of my work, I build out a practice on intuitive leadership and how we can build out more intuitive leadership. But the intuitive has been subdued. And these are all signals, the intuitive, the fact that we're still looking at AI and AR and VR as novel, the preoccupation with silos and deep specialization, and our infatuation with technology. This is how I would lay out our present state, which leads me to this necessity, the need to be able to zig when everyone else is zagging. And this idea of zigging when everyone else is zagging actually comes from my background in fashion. Fashion is excellent at anticipating the next, right? No one in the United States of America needs another pair of jeans or needs another T-shirt. Yet the fashion industry in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar industry because fashion is excellent at tapping into desire and at anticipating the next and seeing around the corner in really short order. Because in the fashion industry, we know that as soon as we release it to the marketplace, it will be knocked off. So this ability to zig when others are zagging is actually a really critical tactic to have. So here are the shifts that I believe we have to start making. Number one, we've got to be able to start shifting away from the silo preoccupation or silos to the detriment of our organizations to becoming much more what I call ambiguous confident, being okay with the murkiness, okay with the blurred boundaries. The ambiguity, the uncertainty isn't going away. So the sooner that we become equipped to manage it, to embrace it, the better off we will be. The second shift we have to make is a shift away from preoccupation with deep specialization to embracing tribes, embracing who can we work with who isn't in our sector, who isn't part of our geography, who doesn't look like us, but who has similar mindsets that can help us to grow. Where might you build tribes to enhance your work? The third shift we have to make is a shift away from skill set. Again, that's kind of connected to deep specialization, to purpose. And that's also connected to the Maslow hierarchy of needs image that I showed you. We're at the top of that hierarchy about what motivates us and what drives us. It's all about meaning and purpose. And finally, we have to make a shift away from the procedural and process and obsession with that to improvisation and working much more improvisationally. So I'd like to explore that in a little bit more detail before I get you guys to start thinking through this. And I'd like us to be thinking about it in 3 areas, in terms of people, in terms of process, and in terms of place. So I'm going to show you some examples where I'm starting to see these shifts materialize. So people. This is a bell curve. And on the bell curve, I've placed images of that kind of stereotypically signify 4 basic demographics, psychodemographics, of which if you work in marketing, if you work in management and leadership, you have to be aware of. So at the bottom of the bell curve, we have Malia Obama. And Malia Obama represents Gen Z. Gen Z is a really interesting group. They're maxed out now at about age 19. My stepdaughter, Sydney, is a member of Gen Z. They are digital natives. They have a very different, they're less optimistic about the state of the world today. They are dealing with climate change as a significant reality. They have no desire to work in corporate America. And Malia Obama's choice to take a gap year, believe you me, gave a lot of universities across the land trepidation. Because if one of the most privileged young ladies in the country decides to say no, put the pause button for a year to Harvard, one of the most storied institutions in our country, what do you think us schmucks who are just basic middle class trying to put together $30,000 a year for college were thinking and responding? The reality is that college debt now has exceeded credit card debt astronomically, and the ROI in a college education is being questioned. So the Gen Zers represent a group of people to whom we have to connect in a very different way and who are motivated in very different ways. The next image of this happy family of 3 on the beach taking a selfie, these are the millennials. And yes, the millennials now are breeding. They now have families. The millennials are no longer the teens and the young adults. And they also are trying to make very different choices about what does family look like to them? How do they want to work? Who says they have to always work and have their work choices driven by who has the best healthcare plan, right? And they're passing down those values to their little baby Gen Zs. The third image of Anderson Cooper is Gen X. I'm a member of Gen X. And as Gen Xers, I kind of feel like we're the threshold doorway generation because in a lot of ways, we made it possible for millennials and Gen Zs to question what marriage should look like, to question what family should look like, to question what community across ethnic lines should look like, right? And we also made it possible, we are definitely sandwiched now for these raging baby boomers who are going out kicking and screaming to also rethink how they want to age. So the final image at the end of the bell curve are what I've represented as the silver tsunami. Who are totally redefining what aging looks like. They're totally, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not so voluntarily, also redefining what it means to age in place, what it means to be still in the workplace. So when we talk about people, we have to interconnect all of these different values, which can sometimes get quite complex. The second piece around people that I just want to talk about is this fear that we've been kind of obsessed with about the robots are taking over, the robots are taking over, the machines will be replacing us. This was a really great essay that was published just last month, this month, January, in Politico magazine. I don't know if you can read the subtitle. The title is The Future of Work and History. The subtitle is, America has a long, complicated track record of dreading that robots would take our jobs. And the essay goes on to talk about how at various stages, all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, we've had this fear of being replaced by robots. Well, the jury is still out a bit in terms of what is the added value to be human in a world that is becoming increasingly saturated with artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality. I came across this publication back in July. I was in an airport on my way to speaking an event, and this is a magazine published by, oh gosh, I just forgot the name of this, PricewaterhouseCoopers, excuse me. And I was struck by the title, right? Because when we think of AI, typically thinking about artificial intelligence. Well, this whole issue was taking it a step further and saying, we thought as human beings, our last holdout was going to be our capacity to create, our capacity to be imaginative, right? This whole issue was talking about this idea of artificial imagination. When robots actually can become artists as well. And this gentleman, Shelley Palmer, very interesting. He's a musician, also an entrepreneur, and he's explored how the lines are actually getting quite blurred about whether or not robots can take on the capacity to be as creative as human beings. And it turns out you can develop an algorithm that can create a really awesome piece of music. But Shelley Palmer said that to get the most out of an algorithm, you still have to be able to ask the right questions. Cognitive, non-repetitive tasks are still really hard to replicate. So this actually gives me hope. And this is actually also fodder for what we're going to be thinking about and talking about each other in terms of the role of improvisation as human beings. The second piece I want to lay out is around process. So I remember the first time I was walking down Walnut Street in Philly, and I saw the ING Espresso Cafe. And I was like, wow, what is this? I didn't understand. Was it a bank? Was it a cafe? Was it just a hangout spot? So here was this bank, this Dutch bank, that was one of the earliest banks to say, come in, have a seat, get free Wi-Fi, have a cup of espresso. We're not going to try to sell you any type of financial services products. Sure, we might have a little ticker tape running across the screen, but we are much more interested about our first touch point with you being around connection, being around what you need to get through your day, a space to rest, a space to think, a space to have a cup of coffee. Well, their forward-thinkingness has continued, and ING has now kind of morphed into Voya Bank. But in the Netherlands, they've done something really fascinating to me. They've completely gotten rid of job titles. And instead, they've embraced how might we integrate agile and lean ways of working. So they're working now based on tribes, chapters, and squads. So it's less about your deep specialization, and it's much more about how might you relate and work with people across former divisions depending on the client need. Really fascinating case. The last piece I want to talk about is place. So this is a picture from the 1930s of Lord and Taylor in Manhattan. It's bustling. It was the center of activity. And these were the days when department stores were not dinosaurs. Department stores were the center of retail theater. In fact, this is a painting going back to 1921 by the painter Florine Stettheimer. The name of this painting is Spring Cell at Bindles. And as you can see in this painting, what she's evoking is just this flurry of energy and interaction. Well, I was really sad to see back in the fall when the New York Times and many other media outlets posted this announcement. The death and end of Lord & Taylor, WeWork purchased the building, and they even talked about the death of leisure. Now that comment, the death of leisure, actually goes back to a sociologist who talked about how in the 1920s and 30s, from his perspective, Carl Veblen was his name, he was looking at the department store as kind of this conspicuous consumption and over-leisureliness, right? Well, the irony of WeWork taking over Lord & Taylor, and they're going to allow them, I think, to have some window displays. But the rest of this really storied building, I mean, this was one of the first department stores in the United States of America, is that we've got this flip. We've got this inversion, going back to one of the values of surrealism, right? Where it takes a lot of work now to shop, right? So you'd rather just shop at your laptop. And we've now expected work to have more leisure, which WeWork is totally open to. And a lot of other retailers have seen the writing on the wall and have tried to reinvent themselves. This is an image of Club Monaco, again in Manhattan. Club Monaco has created a partnership with the Strand bookstore. The Strand bookstore is one of the most iconic bookstores in New York City. Bookstores, as we know, are kind of having a slow death as we've moved to a lot more digital forms of reading. And they also have partnered with a coffee house, Toby's Roasters, in their store. So in the Club Monaco store, they've created kind of a miniature department store where you can read, you can buy flowers, you can shop for a new pair of pants, and you can get a cup of coffee. Urban Outfitters, based in Philadelphia, my hometown, has also been experimenting with retail. So in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, they've created Space 98. It's Space 98, it's about a place to convene. It's a place for DJs playing on actual record players, not through their iPod, to spin out the latest tunes. It's a place to hear poetry readings. It's a place to have pop-up shops. So we have all of these different examples in the retail space of figuring out if people are going to be shopping on their laptops, on their phones, how are we going to get them in? It's kind of this interesting reversion. And finally, the Nike store in Soho is really become a showroom, right? It's a showroom for them to display all of their R&D and awesome developments with knit technology. And then what about the really successful retailers that are online? So the example I want to share is the cosmetics company Glossier, which is just the rage right now and gone bananas, in a lot of ways because of the simplicity of its aesthetic. But they created a one-month pop-up shop this past month. This is what it looked like. It was really, the aesthetic was to kind of be reminiscent of the package design of Glossier. But what they were trying to say is, now that we have this great presence online, how do we create an offline experience? And they're doing that through pop-ups. So I just thought this was a really interesting comment from the founder, Emily Weiss, who said, I was really inspired by theater, performance art, and magic shows when conceiving of the space. Everything about the experience, note experience, not shopping, but the experience is unique. From the way the customers physically interact with the fragrance to how the editors talk to the customers. We are excited to be bringing Glossier U to life offline in a totally weird and unexpectedly luxurious way. So what I thought was really awesome and interesting about what Emily Weiss was saying about this was she really was kind of tapping into the surrealist values of a Salvador Dali, to bring on the weirdness, to bring on the experience, to bring on the interaction between the product and the person. So Lord & Taylor's is no more as we knew it in Manhattan, and now instead we have WeWork. And this is actually an image of WeWork in India. And kind of this, I'm forgetting the name of the city in India, but it's one of the, it's kind of the Silicon Valley of India. But here's WeWork's mission: to help people make a life, not just a living, right? So there's a phrase I've started to use a lot, which is like life. when I was a professor for 16 years, I often wondered, how can we make things in higher ed more like life? And here's what I mean by that. If I want to see a movie, I go onto the Fandango app, and I can quickly see what's playing, I can connect to my friends, I can pay in advance, and it makes it a seamless experience. When I go to the movies, if I'm not sitting at home watching Netflix, it makes it a really seamless, simple experience. Why can't students choose classes like that, right? Who says? So when we think about all the ways that our clients and our consumers are experiencing their everyday lives, how can we make the way we are managing and designing our businesses more like life? Well, that requires us to build in more experiences. And this idea of an experience economy is not a new idea. It actually is something that Pine and Gilmore wrote about 20 years ago, and they kind of focused on companies like Walt Disney. So here's the thing. Experiences are layered, dynamic, and complex. Thus, they're going to require layered, dynamic, and complex methods. And in my view, that means that they need to require us to have the capacity and skill for improvisation. And jazz is a really great way to do that. Jazz is a type of surrealism. There's inversion, there's interdependence between the musicians, there's a lot of ambiguity about what you're hearing and what the main tune was. There are a lot of shared roles. It's collaborative, it's about collage, and it's about co-creation. Growing up in my home, I was surrounded by jazz music. These are some of the types of musicians I heard constantly: Art Blakey, Horace Silver, Lee Morgan, Count Basie, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, because my dad was a big jazz head. He played the acoustic bass, and I learned really early on in my childhood that a way to connect to my father was through music. And I ended up falling passionately in love with the music. Years later, when I was working on a PhD, I was working with the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I started noticing that when the employees were talking about ways that they would delight and please guests, there would be these moments when they would say, when it's working really well, it flows. When it's working really well, it's like jazz. It turns out that there's an entire body of work on improvisational organizations. And Frank Barrett is an example of a scholar. He's a jazz musician out in San Diego who's also a professor who created these 7 principles of jazz improvisation that we can also connect to organizations. I took that a step further and I began to understand that improvisation is actually a complex system. And more specifically, it is a chaotic system. And that word chaord comes from chaos and order, comes from this gentleman on your left. His name is D. Hock. D. Hock was actually the founder of the Visa credit card. And when he was tasked with creating Visa credit card in the early 1960s, he thought, golly, we keep having these organizations which we try to make look like boxes and arrows. He was taking a walk through the woods, and he said, why don't we try to make human organizations more like the way we see nature working? In nature, if a seed falls down from a tree onto the forest floor, a new sapling sprouts up, it's self-organizing, it's an adaptive emerging system. If I skin my knee or my elbow, we don't have permission slip culture of that hurt part of your body asking the brain, what do I do next? There's self-organizing, emergent, adaptive systems. And he said, how could we create human organizations that are more chaotic, that have both chaos and order? Now, chaos is not anarchy. Chaos is randomness. And order is not control. Order is structure. Order is boundaries. So he blended those two words, and it came up with this idea of chaotic system. So in its inception, Visa, this global e-currency system, was really intended to be the self-organizing emergent financial system. So there's 7 principles to Frank Barrett's jazz improvisation: provoking competence, embracing errors, minimal structures, distributed tasks, retrospective sense-making, hanging out, and soloing and supporting. Now it's your turn to think about how you might integrate these ideas into your daily work. So what I'm going to do next, we're going to do something I call think, pair, and share. Does everyone have a worksheet and a pen? Awesome. If you don't, there's some folks handing them out, and just raise your hand and they'll make sure you get one. So there's two sides of the worksheet. The first side is the side with the grid, and that's what we're going to focus on first. I'm going to go through 2 examples at a time so that it gives you time to kind of get used to them. I'm going to ask you to first quietly think and write down an example. You don't have to write down an example for there's 3 columns you'll see. There's a column to think about how would you apply embracing errors, say, around people at your job, around place, or around process. You don't need to think of an example for each one. At least one will do. We still have a hand up over here in the center and 2 hands over, there's 5 hands over here of people who need the worksheet. So let's begin. The first idea from Barrett 7 that he found in the way that jazz musicians work is this idea of provoking competence. So what does that mean? If you've ever been to a jazz performance, you'll observe that there's going to be a moment where after the saxophone player has done their riff or done their solo, they kind of do an offering to the drummer, right? And the drummer has to try to one-up them, and then maybe that passes on to the pianist. But what we see in the way jazz musicians work is less of a competition. Well, maybe it's a little friendly competition, but it's really about these offerings to help the other do better. So where do we see that at work? Well, Google used to have something called 20% time. And this was when they allowed their employees 20% of their work week, maybe every Friday, to work on and tinker with whatever pleased them, whatever they wanted, the stuff that they couldn't get to in their daily work, stuff they had been thinking about that they kind of shelved. Out of Google's 20% time was born Gmail. Several Nobel Peace Prize winners have also been part of organizations that allow them to set aside a bit of time where their competence could be provoked. So when we think about provoking competence, it's about where your organization, either in the way people are interacting with each other, in the way the processes that you have set up, or in the physical space, could you provoke competence. Number 2 is about embracing errors. In jazz, there really isn't anything such as a mistake. It's much more about the build. It's much more about the next iteration of what you can do. So when you think about embracing errors, and when I think about embracing errors, the best example I have is actually from the Ritz-Carlton. Every day around the world at the Ritz-Carlton, and with every team, at every property, there's a meeting called the lineup. Whether you're a maid, an engineer working in the basement, working in the front of the house. And at these lineups, staff compare something called Mr. Bivs. Mr. Bivs is an acronym, and it stands for mistakes, revisions, breakdowns, inefficiencies, and variations. So they have made it a point to build into their culture a way of talking about the breakdowns, the inefficiencies. Instead of it being a shaming game, they've made it a time to share. And they've made it a way for their colleagues to contribute. This happened to, we ran out of forks in this wedding event that we had yesterday. Anyone have a solution for that? If the immediate team can't think of a solution, they'll post the question on the company intranet, and because it's the Ritz-Carlton, they have a great incentive where if you are someone from the South Korea property in Seoul that has an answer for the property in Honolulu, you could win a trip to fill in the blank. So what I'd like you to do now is think quietly to yourself. I'm going to give you 90 seconds to think. Don't speak to your neighbor. Where in your work might you provoke competence? Where in your work might you try to embrace more errors? And the examples were Google's 20% time and Mr. Bivs. And then I'm going to give you a chance to share it with the person sitting next to you. Please begin. Awesome. All right, so that was provoke competence and embrace errors. We'd love for you at the end of this to share, if you would like, we hope you will, more to the large group what some of your ideas were. The third principle in Barrett 7 is this idea of minimal structures. So when you think about a jazz composition, oftentimes the composition is structured where you know what key you're going to play in, you know the chord progression, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the composition. What happens in between is really the magic. So what does that look like in our human organizations? Well, those organizations that value prototyping, and not just prototyping tangible objects, but you can prototype services, you can prototype experiences. A prototype is a rough draft, ugly conceptual mock-up of what you might do. Rather than waiting until the market strategy is pitch perfect and gilded in gold, and then you reveal it to the C-suite, you test it out in iterative stages. Rather than say, we're going to have this whole round of new ways of rolling out the way we're going to meet as an organization, have new ways of meetings, you might prototype different ways to structure meetings. So a prototyping culture in a company is an example of a minimal structure. The fourth idea from Barrett 7 is this idea of distributed tasks. So in a jazz ensemble, there is a give and take of who does what. So for example, there was a jazz ensemble in the 1950s and 60s called the Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Art Blakey was the drummer. He was the de facto leader, but he was never really in the forefront. So oftentimes, it was the other musicians who would take the lead. So how might you redistribute roles and tasks? An example from our work life is Amtrak several years ago announced a writer's residency program. So if you were a writer, you could apply. It was competitive. You could have the opportunity to ride along the Pacific Northwest Rail and get your work done. So how might you find new ways of distributing work and distributing the way you do work? So here's our next think and pair. Where and how could you institute a minimal structure and redistribute tasks at work? Bringing it back to the final three of Barrett 7. The fifth concept from the way Frank Barrett observed the way the jazz musicians worked is that they do a lot of retrospective sense-making. In other words, there's a whole legacy that they build on. So they build on from the past to make something really groovy and original and interesting for the present. An example I would give is the way a lot of fashion firms work. So fashion is all about figuring out how do we tweak and build on what came from the past. For example, the image that I showed in the early part of the presentation of Salvador Dali's crying eye, the brooch, and the way it became incorporated into a 2014 collection from Elsa Schiaparelli is a good example of that. So retrospective sense-making is all about building on the past, not totally discarding it to make something new and interesting. The sixth concept from Barrett 7 is this idea of hanging out. There's so much that happens among jazz musicians in the hallway moments, backstage, when they're resting, when they're lingering, when they're on the tour bus. That's when a lot of the most interesting new compositions get created, where they form connection with each other. The example I give in our work world is when Pixar was first designing and building their new building, which is not so new anymore, they purposely made all of the water fountains and bathrooms only on a couple of floors, so that if you worked on the fourth floor, you had to walk down several stories where you would end up interacting with other people who you typically wouldn't see during the day in order to use the restroom or to have a drink of water. So where in the physical environment of where you work could you create more possibilities and opportunities for hanging out? And finally, the seventh principle is this idea of solo and support, this idea of coming together and going apart, this idea that you allow others to shine in their solo work. And there's a lot of examples of that in our work world. So here's the final opportunity to think and pair. This I'm giving you three as we get to our closing. How might you bring retrospective sense-making, hanging out, and soloing and supporting, swapping roles to your work? Take 90 seconds to think through that quietly to yourself, write down a couple of examples, and then we'll share. Please. All right, so there you have it. Barrett 7, provoking competence, embracing errors, having minimal structures at work, distributed tasks, retrospective sense-making, hanging out, and soloing and supporting. A lot of what we're talking about is this possibility of bringing more improvisation to work, more valuing of mistakes, more self-organizing, and collage. So here's my final question to you, one of my final questions to you. What if creativity wasn't left in the workshop or in the studio, but was part of our everyday work? And a lot of what I think that involves is something I call the wonder-rigor framework. So this is a Jewish theologian named Abraham Heschel, who was known for having said that wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge. As a reminder, a chaotic system consists of both chaos and order. All creative systems are chaotic. All improvisational systems are chaotic. Jazz is chaotic. Well, you can replace for chaos wonder, and you can replace for order rigor. Because the ways that dancers, musicians, and designers problem solve is that they have this high capacity for both. Rigor cannot be sustained without wonder, and wonder ends up being too loosey-goosey without the rigor. Wonder is about daydreaming, pretending, imagining, supposing. It's about performance. Rigor is about practicing and time on task and the critique and showing up over and over again. So the final question I want us to think about, and maybe we can just do this as an open mic, is how might you become more of a boundary spanner? How might you bring more wonder and more rigor into your work, given what I just described consists of rigor, given what I just described, wonder consists of, and the fact that jazz musicians have to work that way. As we end, I'd love to hear from a few people about what you shared with Barrett 7 and how that relates for you in terms of bringing more wonder and rigor to your organizations. Do we have an extra microphone? Could someone speak really loudly? I'd love someone to volunteer and just share out what were some of the things that you thought about in doing this exercise.
If I may share. So I'm talking with the online audience, and they're sharing a lot of insights. Megan is saying that her organization holds all staff debriefs after every conference that includes wins, improvement, action items from every member of the team. And then Tahira added to that saying, a well-constructed debrief should also be your greatest sales tool. What went well? What can we make it even better next year? When can we start working on that?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Inspiring anyone else to share? We have a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to reaffirm the hanging out thing, because I made a pledge after a big management training thing years ago that I would walk around the building, because I realized that way I'd probably meet more people, I'd get to hear what was going on, and I'd generate more kind of interest and activity and awareness. And the other thing that I'd use to support that hanging out thing was I also pledged to introduce people to each other, because people didn't know who everybody was.
Right.
It was a really simple thing, but it worked so well, just actually making an introduction. Do you know so-and-so? This is so-and-so.
I love that. That's kind of another version of the offering that musicians give to each other. Nice, thank you. Maybe two more?
Hi, I manage the Tulsa Convention Center, and we are renovating a huge portion of the building. And now I'm starting to wonder, are we thinking too traditionally about how a convention center is used and what people want? And how can I apply more of that interaction and non-traditional business into using this space to make it so much more than a convention center really is?
I love that you're asking that question, especially going back to the people slide I showed, the bell curve of the expectations of Gen Zers, Millennials, even at this enormous aging population. It's awesome. Thank you.
Hi there. What I'd want to see is to take out the taboo of having open brainstorm sessions at work and just free thought, free expression, and that it actually becomes part of the culture of the company, that we allocate time and put an emphasis in doing that versus feeling like we're taking 5 minutes away from a proposal or planning something.
Awesome, when in fact that's going to add value to the proposal or to the work product that you need to deliver. Awesome. Thank you so much. I just want to end with this final thought that the future of work, in my view, is really about wonder. In other words, it's time to get surreal. Thank you so much.